Thank you for sticking around for our forum. So we get to share a little bit and learn a little bit about really amazing group that's started work here in the Bloomington area in the last couple of years, and who we have formed a relationship with. And BARC, the Bloomington Antiracism Coalition, has been doing work with current and former alumni of Bloomington schools, and they're going to share a little bit about what kind of work they've been up to and how what their vision is for the schools of Bloomington and for our community. And so I'm going to introduce Trevon Tellor, who's one of the leaders of BARC, as well as Daniella Kunkel and Angela Kunkel. We got the duo this morning. So let's thank them for being here, and I'll let them take it away.
Thanks. Hey everybody, it's good to talk to you again. We help lead the Bloomington Antiracism Coalition. We were formed after the uprising here last May. It was me and a couple of people I graduated with. We were trying to change schools, and so they talked to me 2 weeks after, and they were like, "You were a socialist?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I am. So activism's cool." And so I jumped in on that, and we were doing curriculum work, because when I was in high school, I never read a book by anybody who wasn't white. Which is pretty crazy. And then a couple months later, we got linked up with Daniella and Angela, and they had been collecting data on cops in schools and kids being arrested and cited. And so we kind of merged our groups in July of 2020. And at this point, a lot of our work was more reformist-based, and we were talking with principals and school board and superintendent. The meetings didn't go very well, and we got kind of ran around for 3 months. And so then some of our leadership left for college in that fall, and so the only people that were really left in terms of a leadership role were kind of me and Danielle and Angela and a couple of other people. And a lot of us had been involved in some more kind of direct action, focused, protest work. And so then we started to kind of shift our group from just talking to principals to actually doing actions. In July of 2020, we had a protest here that went by our kind of city building, and a lot of y'all were there. It was really great. We've kind of shifted to that, done some actions, have been doing some education work, and so if you guys want to talk about what we do.
I'll talk a little bit about, can I move this down a little? Our demands. So like Trey said, we were two groups that kind of came together, and we sat down and decided what are the things that we need to fight for this current students. And we decided fighting to remove police presence from our high schools and middle schools, and creating culturally competent resources for our Black and Brown Indigenous students. Also creating a more inclusive curriculum. We have been working with social studies teachers and English teachers, trying to create, those gaps in literature and history. And also we've been working just within students to create that sense of community through affinity groups, we're meeting monthly, and kind of creating those bonding community spaces to share some of the things that were going on in school that otherwise they didn't have spaces to share and talk about. Sorry, my voice is really bad, so I'm gonna give it up to Daniella to talk a little bit more.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us also. So a little bit about like how we work and like the lenses that we choose to use in the work that we do. We really believe in like being in solidarity with young people. It's really hard to be a young person right now. We're facing a climate crisis, a racial justice uprising, militancy in our cities by our police. It's really hard to be young right now, and we believe in creating a future where young people just get to be young and get to have a childhood. I was talking to my dad the other day about like, oh, like it's really hard growing up right now, like I'm facing a climate crisis. And he was talking about when he was young, he was facing like the nuclear crisis. And for a long time, we haven't had young people being able to experience what youthhood is. And we want that for our young people. We want young people to be able to enjoy the outdoors, be able to enjoy learning and being in community with each other. So we really believe in being in solidarity with young people and that our work is driven by young people. We also believe in abolition, and that is a big word, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of people, but for us it means we can't have schools that have police presence in them. We can't have schools that believe in a hierarchy of power where teachers are the only ones who hold knowledge. Students also hold so much knowledge and they know so much about their own experiences as living human beings, and we need to respect that in order to have better relations, especially intergenerationally. And we also believe in working towards anti-capitalism. We can't have a world where rich people continue to get rich off of the backs of poor people. That's why we have young people suffering so much right now. You have young people who are forced to work in order to help support their family, and they can't focus on being young people. So in all of our work, we're really driven by young people and the power that young people have, but also the dream that young people can one day be just young people again. So like we talk the talk, but how do we walk the walk? So last year we worked a lot on getting ethnic studies as something that is offered at our high schools, and so now there's a curriculum for ethnic studies in Bloomington public schools that we were able to work closely with the teachers to write. We also have been working really hard on getting cops removed from the schools, and that has been a really long fight and something we're really looking forward to amping up again. This past year we did an underground school that was actually hosted here at Christ the King, where we provided political education and movement history education to high schoolers so that they could learn about things that aren't talked about in school. And that was really exciting. And also just like community building. How can we come together in Bloomington? Bloomington is constantly changing. It's becoming more Black and brown and Indigenous. And how can we make sure that people feel welcome here and that they have space here? So we've been doing like BARC bonding events where we eat pizza and do bonfires. We also had like a pride picnic where we had a Bloomington drag queen come and perform for us, and just really making sure that young people feel like they have a place here in Bloomington is really important to us. Yeah, do people have questions? We kind of threw a lot at you, but we are just really excited to get to work with young people, and like as young people, we're excited to be trusted by younger people and hopefully like help guide them towards a future that is more sustainable for young people and more focused on young people. But yeah, we welcome any questions that you might have. Go ahead. Yeah, so right now we have like hall monitors at our high schools. I think it was like two years ago. There was a stabbing at Jefferson, and it was the hall monitor who prevented the incident from getting worse. Also historically, since the shooting at Columbine, I think it's over 50,000 school resource officers, which are uniformed cops, have been hired, but they haven't stopped a single school shooting. Instead, they've arrested over 1 million students. So nationally, historically, we can see that school resource officers aren't doing the job that they were intended to. Instead, they're criminalizing students, mostly Black and brown students, who are being then pushed into the school to prison pipeline. And here in Bloomington, 17% of Bloomington students are Black, but 46% of the students who are arrested in Bloomington are Black. So there's a huge disparity racially on who's being arrested in Bloomington, and that's a trend that you can see nationwide. So school hall monitors, a restorative justice counselor, someone who can work on incidences where harm has been caused either by staff or students, are what we see as the future for creating spaces for students who are safe. We have to consider all students, not just white students, in safety measures at schools. Does that answer your question? Oh, yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah.
I just wondered, I said I understand where you wouldn't want a police uniformed presence, an adult maybe, but would there be some way to provide security? And you explained that beautifully, but now I'm worried about, are the hall monitors students or are they adults?
No, they're staff, they're adults, yeah.
Okay, so they're trained and they know how to prevent. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Mm-hmm.
My question's on the funding of these police officers. Is it a joint between Bloomington Schools and Bloomington City? And how does that work? And then if we let those people go, could we get an extra counselor
Yeah.
in every school?
Yeah, so right now, the way things are set up in Minnesota, and this was part of our discovery and the whole headache that was trying to figure out why we even have cops in schools. After the shooting at Columbine, a lot of states put forth legislature that put funding for schools to hire a police officer for their district. So that's how they're paid, is through a state mandate. So they're paid through the police department. So there's that part. However, the agreement in Bloomington Public Schools is a verbal agreement. There's no contract that the police department signs, there's no contract that the school board signs outlining what the roles of the school resource officer is. So in our experience, when we talked with the principal at Jefferson, he was saying, the school resource officer is there to help with medical emergencies. When we talked to the students, they saw the school resource officer as someone who was a police presence in their schools. When we talked to the police department, they said the school resource officer was someone who was supposed to be building relationships with students. So each of these stakeholders were seeing a different relationship that the police officer was supposed to hold in these schools. And that's a big issue. When no one knows what the responsibility is of the police officer, how can we hold them accountable for things that happen? And when there's no contract written between the school and the police department, how can we change the relationship? So our hope is that because there's no contract, we're not binded to them in any way. We can end this relationship now. We don't have to wait 10 years for a contract to be over. We can end it now, and we can use money from the police department or from the school. I think the funding is partially from the school, but most of their salary comes from the police department because they're police officers, but the school will subsidize some of it. So can we use that money to hire a restorative justice counselor or even a college counselor who knows more about the Black experience of going to college? How can we make sure students at our schools are better prepared for their future and not worried about a police presence in their high schools? I hope that answers your question. Do you want to say something?
Yeah. I just wanted to add one other thing, is often when we're talking about abolition, we're talking about removing these systems that have historically harmed Black and brown communities, but I think there's also a lot of space for us to imagine as a community what our schools can look like and what the improvement and hope can look like, and that means making a more community-involved school district. That means parents having conversations about what safety looks like with their kids. That's typically not happening because we just see police officers in school as being the one-all. But what would our schools look like if there was conversations about safety happening within the classrooms, within parents, within community members, because I think that's where the real transformation happens, is when community starts to get involved in the things that we thought the police department was gonna, completely solve, but really it's on all of us to have conversations about safety and justice and kindness. Yeah. You had a question? Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much. My question is simply, what victories have you experienced? No, there's so many challenges at this time, as you named, and like when I saw that BARC was going to be hosting an underground school here, I thought that was, a victory. So what would you name as, even if they're like really, really small things, but what have been some of the victories in your work that has given you hope?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest ones was our protest that we had in Bloomington last July in 2020, which was pretty awesome. We got about 400 people out, and we were walking along 98th Street. I think another big accomplishment is we had a walkout for cops in schools last spring, which is really cool. We had about 100 kids from Kennedy walk out and about 50 from Jefferson, and then we walked to the kind of like city government, and so we hung out and yelled for an hour, which is just really cool. Underground school as well was pretty huge. We had about 6 kids who would come often, and we talked about all kinds of things, and it was college kind of I'd say it's college kind of level work, because I'm in college and I'm these kids are talking really well, and I'm this is what college should be, but it isn't, unlike with a lot of my peers. So and I think just a victory is we've kind of gotten Bloomington into organizing. There wasn't a lot going on previous to us coming here, so I think we're proud of that, and getting kids in. So yeah, I think we've awakened some kind of organizing spirit in Bloomington and gotten kids into it. So, and if kids are organizing at 16, by the time it's they're 21, they're going to be awesome. Because I've only been really intensely organizing for 2 years, and I am learning a lot. And so if you're kind of getting it when you're 16, then when you're 21 or 22, you will be the greatest organizer ever. So yeah, of course.
I'll also add, I think a really big victory has just been seeing so much growth in the students that we work with, the amount of confidence of students who wouldn't even speak up in meetings to emceeing an entire rally is seriously one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. Seeing students who were in BARC now organizing their own protests with Earth Corps at Jefferson is really incredible. Also seeing the friendships being built among the students who, from Kennedy and Jefferson maybe wouldn't have been friends because of the divide that we have created here between East and West Bloomington, is something that is really special. And so I think a huge victory has just, for me, has been being trusted by these young people and watching them flourish and become beautiful people who are truly rooted in love and care for their community and for each other and for themselves, and figuring out how to draw boundaries and how to stop when they need to stop and how to keep going when they need to keep going, and how to educate themselves and figure things out and make mistakes. I think that has also been one of the biggest victories for us, is just creating students who know what they want to do and are doing it, and feel empowered to do it.
I think a key word is conversation that you brought up. And so do you have forums where students can come together and just talk about and get to know each other so that they have each other's backs during the day or after school? If you share a story, then I think it's really, really impactful.
Yeah, we've been doing it with them. We try to do it about every month or two, and kids will come on Zoom, and we'll kind of just talk about kind of like what is going on. I think one of our biggest ones was after Dante Wright was killed last spring, and we had about 25 kids in, and we talked about it. And it was like really good. It was really good like growth and kind of like processing. So we try to do that a lot. I think what is like something we've been aiming to do is do it kind of like with everybody like over 18 too, because we talk to kids a lot, but like parents we don't really talk to often. So like something we're trying to like build to is having some kind of like parent forum assembly kind of thing to kind of like talk to them, because honestly most of who we've talked to is like 21 or younger, which is great, but also like we're in a town that has like everybody here, so we're trying to like reach out to everybody. So
police arrests, what are the arrests for, and what kind of person could prevent those arrests instead of just being on the back end of punishment?
Yeah, so a difficulty in this specific data request is because the people who are arrested are minors. The police department didn't reveal to us like what the arrests were. Something like I can think of and speak to on in my high school experience was a lot of like the students who would get arrested at my school. It was like drugs, fighting, those kind of things. So how do we get to the root cause of why students are using drugs? How do we get to the root cause of why students are fighting? That's like the real question. We need to create school systems that are supportive of students, not looking to penalize students. If a 14-year-old is vaping in a bathroom, like, I don't think they're doing it because they want to vape. What are they trying to cope with? What are they dealing with at home? What are they dealing with their peers? What support do they need at school to be successful and not feel the need to go and vape in the bathroom at 14? So yeah, we don't know what the arrests were, but when I think of my own high school experience, I think of the drug dogs that came into school, students who would get arrested for drugs or fighting. And like what we really need to do as a community is figure out what young people need and how do we get to the root cause of what it is that they need. They need community, they need a place where they feel like they can be heard, they need a place where they can express themselves. And right now that's not the reality, so they have to look for other avenues to do that. Yeah, it's a hard question to answer just because we don't know why they're arrested, because we don't have the data, because they're minors, which I guess like is good that they're keeping their privacy, but it's hard to figure out those root causes. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I just wanted to add another thing onto that, which is that even if we were to know exactly what students are arrested for, there's a pretty big discrepancy between, my apologies, what we think of as like criminal activity, especially when we're talking about young people. Young people have barely any legal rights, which is why young people are such a vulnerable population for police officers to be around. When we started this work, we started collecting stories from students about their interactions with police. Just one of the ones that I remember hearing was of being interrogated for, I think, like 3 of their class periods about potentially having drugs in their locker, because like a drug dog sat down next to their locker, and then eventually being let go because they didn't find anything, and it turned out they just had smelly gym socks in their locker. And that's a pretty like small story, but then we also heard pretty dramatic stories from, 20 years ago, students at Kennedy swearing in the hallway and then being like thrown around by the police officer. So when we talk about criminality, those things are looked at in the lens of what the police officer views as being a criminal offense and being worthy of, those kind of punishments. But once again, there's not space for that community conversations, the parents, teachers to have a conversation of what things are actually harming students versus what things this one officer in the school thinks is harming students. Another interesting thing to note about the police officers within Bloomington specifically is that they are trained detectives, which means that like all of their training is to look for like a greater, plot or criminal offense, which is oftentimes with young people just like not the case. And it does cause a lot more tension and harm because of those kind of trainings that our officers have.
I'm not sure if some of what you just said answers my question, but I'm wondering, is there curriculum within the schools that deal with any of the students, I don't know, some ways, abilities to resolve conflict, to do those sorts of things, and what is the state of paid counselors and staff that are dealing with students with issues?
Okay, I'm going to try and remember all the parts to your question, so let me know if I don't answer all of it. So Minnesota actually has one of the worst ratios of students to in-school counselors, which is like deeply upsetting because students deserve to have people that they can speak to. So that's already an issue that we're facing here, is that we don't have enough counselors. I think like a lot of people can generally agree that like teachers are underpaid and overworked, which creates a lot of tensions in schools. And right now it's mostly teachers who are being asked to do this work of figuring out what punishments or restorative justice measures should be taken for students when they're already so overworked in their day. And so it's hard, right now, I don't think there's really anything in the schools for curriculum or learning experiences, story circles, or restorative justice for how can we prepare students to get through conflict. Conflict is something that we all experience every day, and it's important that young people are treated with just as much respect and autonomy as adults are when you face conflict. As an adult, you're trusted to be able to work through conflict, but for some reason we don't trust young people to be able to work through their conflict. So how do we make sure students are prepared to get through and work through conflict with each other and with their peers and with adults? Right now, I don't think there's really much of anything, and that's something we really want to see happen, is how do we encourage students to become emotionally intelligent to be able to work through conflict? There's a lot of spaces where adults intervene where they really don't need to, where students can work through it together. But how do we create those spaces, I think, is something that we really need to start looking at as a district. Hiring a restorative justice counselor would be a really good first step, but also creating spaces where students feel like they can talk to each other is something that I think we're trying to do, but we definitely need the help of the district to make that a wide spread value of the schools. I hope that answers your question. I don't know if either of you have something to add. No? Yeah.
I just wanted to add also that there's some pretty good research about how including culturally diverse histories and languages also increases or decreases, the feelings of feeling left out and unheard. And oftentimes, from the experiences of the students, I've worked with many elementary school age students. A lot of times, acts of rage and anger come from feeling unheard, and that feeling is only exaggerated for students when stories about them and stories about their ancestors aren't represented in their school at all. What does that, if you think about it, what might it feel like to go to school 8 hours a day and feel completely erased? Feel like your stories aren't going to be told in that space. That opens up a lot of feelings of being unheard and not worthy of being there.
So, as leaders of BARC, you and some of your fellows have been engaged in meeting with members of the school board, members of the city council, the mayor, the police department. I wonder if you would share a little bit about, what do you feel like your reception has been with some of those groups? Have there been some groups that have been, what have been the differences between the groups that you've been sort of meeting with, and just kind of share what's your experience with that?
Cool. I'm going to try to sound not like bitter about it, because I am. So the school board and like superintendent, we haven't met with the new one yet, so I can't comment on him. But our original meetings are with the school board and the like superintendent who retired in the spring. At least from my perspective, and I think this is mostly shared, they didn't really have any interest in really doing anything about anything. They wanted to meet with us again and again and again, and we wouldn't accomplish anything. We were promised to be allowed to present at a because we were going to talk at a study session with the whole board. That never happened, despite us emailing them multiple times. In our conversations with our police chief, which have been the interim chief, also haven't been particularly fantastic. It's a lot of the same lines that we hear all the time without any kind of like dialogue of like, what could you do differently? Like, are you listening kind of things? And I've been in some like community cafe things with like Chief Hartley, and we've been talking about some stuff, and he'll mention something about like calling the police on people like cursing at a park, and then I'll be like, Officer Hartley, don't you think that that'll get a person killed if like they're black? And he's like, well, people have a right to have like clean parks free of cursing. And I'm like, well, we've talked about this all the time, is if you call the cops on everything, people will get hurt. This is just how it has. So we've had all these talks with them like numerous times, and it didn't go very well. We've met with the principals of both Kennedy and Jefferson. I think the Kennedy principal has been a lot easier to talk to. When we talk to the principal at Jefferson, it's usually kind of a brick wall. There's no movement. And so it's like this kind of like what's happened is kind of like why we moved from being more reform-based and working on a higher level to doing like to actions and protests and like rallies, because we tried to talk to them for a while and they didn't listen, but they do when we cause a little trouble. So we don't really have an option now but to do that, which is like what like protesters have been doing for like 100 years. So like a lot of organizers, people in power don't take us like seriously, and I think a lot of that also is because like I'm 21, Daniella's 22, Angela, are you 20? Yeah, 20, and our like kids are like 14 like through 18. And so in our country, which is ageist, right, like kids don't have any power, and like youth are not like intelligent, which is also a problem that has been like coming up often. We'll be talking to them and they'll like assume that like we don't grasp kind of like, and we're like, well, we do know, like, because we were talking about removing cops from schools with the school board person a couple weeks ago, and they tried to explain how council works to us, and we're like, we've been organizing around y'all for a year, we know how it works with your council, you don't have to like tell us that. So that's been my impression. I don't know if y'all have any other further impressions about it.
Yeah, I think like as young people, like we're dismissed a lot, but also as a group who's mostly young women and girls, we're extra dismissed by groups who operate through white supremacy and misogyny, especially in our experiences with the police department, feeling really talked down to and condescended by white men who think that they know the experiences of black and brown girls better than they do. Is really disturbing. And I will also say, like, we clearly experienced a situation where in meetings where it was just young people by ourselves, we were not being listened to or cared to, and it wasn't until Rory so kindly invited us to a meeting that all the church leaders were having with the mayor that we were actually heard and listened to, and that promises were followed through. And that's really disheartening in a community that is filled with young people. Sure, we can't vote. We don't get to re-elect or unelect people from our offices. But we're the people who are going to decide to live in Bloomington or not. We're the people who are going to decide to raise our families here or not. And to be so dismissed and only acknowledged in the presence of other adults is troubling, especially when it comes to the school board. The school board wouldn't exist without its students, and for them to not care about what students have to say should upset all of us.
So, recognizing that often the way to create change is shifting power, and recognizing where you can use power. As a white parent of a Bloomington public school student, I recognize that I probably have more power than others. What can I do as a parent to help create the change that you guys are fighting so hard for?
Yeah, I think a really easy way is public comment at council things is a pretty good way. And also, as I talked about earlier, we're looking into doing some parent organizing and trying to get some kind of like parent forum or kind of like parent like BARC kind of like branch off thing to do some organizing with and maybe some protests with. So if you're interested in that, and anybody here is, we would love to like talk to you, and we can talk about like what it would look like and like what it would mean, and we can do some like peer education stuff. Like we have our curriculum, which like we wrote, that has 8 classes. It's a pretty good like organizing crash course. So if people are interested in doing that, I think that's a good way. But yeah, just like sharing like what we do, coming to our actions. We're on Facebook. So if you like follow us there, you'll kind of like see like what we're doing. A lot of the times that we have actions, we have like parents come and act as like marshals just to kind of like keep us all like safe. So like that's also an easy kind of like way to jump in and help as well. And just like sharing like what we talk about and coming to our actions, but also want to really push the parent organizing thing because that would be super fun and I'd love to organize with people. So just hit me up if you want to talk about that. We can get the ball rolling.
I also wanted to add that I'm not sure how many of you have, young people in your homes right now, but I think starting to have conversations with them about what their schools look like. I think there's a kind of a tension in Bloomington in which this city is changing so rapidly, and oftentimes this is an intergenerational city where people grow up here and then raise their kids here, and oftentimes parents' experiences growing up in Bloomington now do not match what their child's experiences are. Also, when we look at like use of social media, young people are being exposed to so many pretty traumatic events and things that are happening. And I think as parents, starting to have that conversation about, you have power as a young person, and I will support you in that, can also be a really great role for parents to take upon themselves. Because without that kind of support for a young person, it's really hard to continue and ask them to go into those schools and this kind of world.
I just want to say thank you so much for being here with us and for sharing and for all the work that you're doing here in Bloomington. I find it inspiring. I find it the work of, really, I sort of feel like it's the work of witnessing, of seeing the world as it should be and not being happy with the world as it is and working on that vision and sort of living into that world where people are not treated differently because of the color of their skin, or they're not treated differently because of how old they are, but they are valued and loved for the full people that they are. And so I thank you for sharing that vision with the youth of our city, and I find it inspiring. Thanks for sharing that with us today. small group, but a good group. Yeah, it's great to have it. Great to have it.